Well, once again, welcome to worship this morning. And I want to thank Heather for reading this morning and praying, and for everyone who's here helping make worship come alive and be part of our Sunday morning rhythm and ritual. I was thinking a lot about rhythm and ritual lately. There was something comforting maybe in the midst of this pandemic and all the upset and topsy-turvy that is caused to actually spend a little time watching the Seahawks play on TV. That was something a little normal. I'm sure many of you Seahawks fans have maybe felt the same way. I couldn't help but laughing a little bit last night as I watched just a taste of my first college football game of the fall. That's a rhythm and ritual that I have every fall. And it reminded me of different times when those who support different college football teams would have sort of anti-that, the other team party. There's sort of some fundamental divisions in our state between those who are fans of the Huskies and those who are fans of the Cougars. Oh, what different times those were when that was the kind of basic fundamental division among us. Or if you live in Oregon, where I did growing up, you were a Duck fan or a Beaver fan, or where my wife Kirsten grew up in Texas, you were a Longhorn fan or maybe an Aggie fan. These were the divisions that we seem to care about and laugh about and joke about. Something's changed in this last year, and maybe the pandemic has just exacerbated it. The fundamental tensions of our days have been exposed as being much deeper and more life-challenging. You think about the divisions between those who wear masks in public and those don't. Those who somehow focus on a neighbor orientation and those who focus on a self or liberty orientation. You think about the divisions between red states and blue states, and underneath those colors, the real lived experience of people and what they are afraid of or hopeful for. You think about how our political scene is so polarized between Democrats and Republicans. You think about those who work from home and have the ability to do that versus those who have public-facing jobs that necessitate their presence in the midst of crowds, putting their own lives at risk to make sure the store shelves in the grocery are stocked. And today at 11 a.m., our governor here in the state of Washington is going to make some announcements about restrictions or rollbacks. And in the midst of those very practical guidelines that will be coming forth are bubbling up all of these deeper tensions and fundamental divisions. Paul spoke about a fundamental division or tension in his day when in the reading from Thessalonians that Heather read spoke of people being children of the day or children of the night, a fundamental division that in his context was seen in the midst of sudden or unexpected change coming upon people. He says, "For you yourself know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. It'll be like labor pains suddenly coming upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape," Paul says. In the midst of sudden and unexpected change, topsy-turviness, much like we have experienced over this past year, in the midst of that context, fear begins to well up in the hearts of people. Really is at the heart of being a child of the day or a child of the night. Fear in the heart is about being a child of the night. And drunkenness, as Paul writes, is a sign of avoidance or not coming to the grips with the fear that is present. It's a tactic to pretend that it's not changing. It's all just, I'm going to step away from reality and become drunk. On the other side, the children of the day live with faith and love and hope in their heart. And the sign of that, opposite of drunkenness, the sign of living with faith and love and hope in your heart is a building up of one another in community. Therefore, Paul says, encourage one another and build up each other as indeed you are doing. Avoidance and drunkenness is a sign of one way of living in fear. Building one another up, supporting one another in community is a sign of living out of faith, hope, and love. Another way of maybe approaching this dynamic, these fundamental tensions, is also by saying that when you live in fear, you're really about scarcity. That things are not abundant. And when you're afraid, you hunker down and you clutch to yourself, or you try to gather in what you can. Remember what happened when the pandemic first arrived on the scene? No toilet paper. No paper towels. People were afraid. And out of a sense of scarcity, they gathered to themselves. On the other hand, living out of hope is akin to living out of this sense that no matter what topsy-turviness is going on around us, we're going to live out of an amazing abundance that God provides no matter what. It might not always look the same, but we trust that it is there and it gives us hope. My experience of this in my younger days was especially true when I was going through my divorce. I lost a lot of family and friends in that process. And I began to live out of fear. Fear of loneliness, fear of isolation, fear of being separate from those relationships that had given me life. A fear asking myself in the darkness of the night, is this it? And I grow old and die alone. Separate. I was lucky in those days not just to be the pastor of a community of faith, but I was very blessed that the community in which I was serving as pastor held me up and built me up. In the midst of loss, the community of faith, like Paul says, encouraged me, built me up. It is what they did. The community of faith gave me hope. And in the midst of that hope, I was able to live not in fear, but in love and faith. It was an amazing, terrible, and wonderful time, all wrapped into one. And really was an experience that speaks to what Paul says in Thessalonians. God's grace in that community moved me from fear and scarcity to hope and abundance in the world of relationships. In the parable that I just read, there is also this tension, this fundamental division, and it is about scarcity and it is about abundance and living out of fear or living out of hope. Now, the parable is problematic upon first hearing. We experience as the words roll in and through our ears, abundance of imagery around masters and slaves, which we do not relate to the way they did in Jesus' day. There's also this sense of harshness and judgment at the end of the parable, which for many of us is not what we associate at all with a loving and good God who cares for us and never forsakes or abandons us. But having said that, bear with me for a moment as we kind of look at this parable again. A master leaves his 3 slaves with an enormous sum of money. I spent some of this week looking at the different calculations of how much money those talents were for those slaves in those days. Came across the board with lots of different options. Let's just say it's more money than any of us have, okay? It's enormous. It's abundant. And they are entrusted, these slaves of the master, to live with this amazing abundance. Take it here, live with it, the master says. And they do so as they have the ability to live with it. The master knows that and provides them with this abundance accordingly. And as we have heard, the first one trades and makes 5 more talents. The second does work and makes 2 more. Where the third hides this amazing abundant gift in a hole. And then we are told a long time later, the master arrives for an evaluation of the situation. What have you done with this abundance? The master wants to know. He came to settle accounts. Now, often, if we create some analogies here, we want to kind of relate the master to God and the slaves to us, and we fear that we're not doing enough with what God has provided us in terms of gifts in our lives. And I want to just tweak that imagery for a second and have us think about it this way. What if the master represents Jesus, the one who is here with us and blesses us, departs for a time, and promises to make a return, who leaves us entrusted with such amazing abundance of gifts, and simply asks us to live with them according to our ability? If this is true, or an interesting way to get into the parable, it changes things a little bit. We have been invited by Jesus to follow him, to live in and through an amazing abundance that he provides of gifts, of grace bestowed upon us. Kind of like being a community that supports and builds one another up and encourages one another in the gifts we have received. And as we do so, we enter into the joy of Jesus. Now, that's a little different way thinking about what's going on, the dynamic here. Of course, we know in the parable that one of the slaves does not do this, does not live out of the abundance that the master has provided. In fact, we are told this one is afraid. The perception of this one is that the master is harsh and greedy. And so I ask this question for all of us as we listen to this story again. Is this perception actually true? Or does this one, the third slave, just live in fear? Which colors his or her perception of the whole situation? I know it does for me. When I am afraid, I tend to look at others as harsh, as opponents, as judgmental of me. when I live out of joy or love or hope, I see the people around me much differently. A people who are gifts to me from God, who desire my good, who want to build me up like I experienced in community during a terrible time in my life. I think it's funny that the master neither confirms nor denies anything that the third slave says. Simply lets the third slave have his or her own perception of the situation. Living out of fear negates the invitation to live a life of amazing abundance. When we live in fear, whether by choice or situation, judgment becomes almost inevitable. In fact, we might even be able to say we do it to ourselves when we live in fear. I want all of us to think about that. How much fear can color our perception of one another. Living, though, out of a sense of an amazing abundance and the love of Jesus in our lives creates a totally different situation. It is a situation in which the joy of Jesus sort of just permeates us in and through our lives and our community life. We become a different people, and we act and behave differently. In fact, our fall stewardship program, Building a Culture of Generosity, is rooted in the sense that we live in and through and out of the amazing grace of God that we know in and through Jesus Christ. In fact, today our statements of intent that we are going to bless, the giving of these statements of intent are the opposite of hiding our gifts or talents in the ground. The exact opposite of what the third slave does. As we present these intents to one another, it is as if what is in our hearts, the joy of the Master, the love and grace that we know, it is as if we just bring them out and show them to the one who gave them to us in the first place. That's what making a statement of intent is all about, and that's why we bless them. Faith, hope, joy, being made public in order that the world might see what we have been given. In just a little bit, we're going to bless those intents. And I want us to think about that. That as we do that, we truly enter into the joy of the Master. Thanks be to God. Amen.